Thanks. I'm not quite sure how to top that, but I'll try. So can I start with a survey? And it's not going to be quite as embarrassing as Rory's. Imagine for a second, I've gone around the room and I've taken everyone's mobile phone and I've put them in a big pile on this stage. Just try to think how long it would take you before you started getting a little bit itchy. So hands up. So everyone, hands in the air. Put your hand down if you think an hour. If you think you could keep your hand in the air if you think you could last an hour. Okay. Keep your hand in the air if you could think you could last till lunch. Throughout the day? Throughout the week? Okay, that's really interesting, because normally there's always one person who says, yes, I could survive. And then they look really smugly at everyone else. But, you've been completely honest. So back in 2003, scientists tried this. They got 220 American students, and they took their mobile phones, and they said, how long can you last without checking it? And of those 220 people, only 3 of them lasted 3 days. And that was before the iPhone. That was before status updates, notifications, before all of the things which have come along on our phones to hook us into them. Other scientists have tried kind of reproducing these experiments, and they weren't able to because they couldn't get enough people who were willing to give up their phones. So my book's called The Great Acceleration, and it's about how life is speeding up. And the phone for me is the great symbol of this, because it incarnates, it sums up my argument completely. So the first is, it's a miracle of technology, that it's Moore's law in action. This thing here, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, this is not what a phone looked like. I've got a 1-year-old child. We have toys for him, and they have little phones on them that you can turn the dial on. And that's not a phone. He has no, it's so bizarre that we're teaching our kids that these things are called phones. It's fun, we were at some friends the other day, and they've got a 2-year-old, and he crawled over to their wedding picture and started trying to swipe it. Because to him, a rectangular slab of glass, that's what a phone is. And, given another 5 or 10 years, a phone will be a thing, possibly a thing on your glasses, possibly a thing, on your arm, that it will do all the things a phone does at the moment, but it will overlay, it will connect you with VR if you want to, AR, it'll do your heartbeat, it'll be able to tell you when the people you're talking to are lying, which will be quite useful, or, when their heartbeat goes up, which will be quite useful if you're going on a date. So it's just it's the most powerful symbol of the things which are driving the speed of life forward, which is obviously technology, and it's disruptive. The change to the iPhone, to this model of phone, destroyed some of the largest and most impressive companies in the world. Nokia and BlackBerry, which themselves had only come about a few years before. It's made companies like Snapchat and Instagram. It's Google. It's made Google and Samsung into giants. When we talk about the sort of change and disruption and churn and froth and all of those things, the phone is kind of where that's happening. But above all, the phone's interesting to me because of when I started looking at acceleration, I started looking at why the pace of life is speeding up. I found it was that, as Rory said, we're social creatures. We all take our pace from other people. So, in the early 90s, scientists, they went to 30 cities around the world, and they sat, and watched the world go by, and they counted the time it took someone to go, from one end of the main street to the other. And then, they got a statistic, and they said, okay, this is a pace of life index. And what they found, as Rory actually suggested, was that the larger the place you lived in, the faster your pace of life. So if you're in London, you'll go around the supermarket twice as fast as someone who lives in a small village near Folkestone. And then in 2006, the British Council decided to see whether this had changed. So again, 30-odd cities, sat there on the main street, watched people go, all the way down the street. And what they found was that across the world, the pace of life had speeded up, that people were walking 10% faster than they had been 10 years before. And there are all sorts of other metrics, our levels of patience, our tolerance for delay, the speed with which we talk. We really are. We're social creatures. We take our cues from each other, and those cues are accelerating. And we often sort of talk about this and think about this as something that's being done to us. that, that Mark Zuckerberg is sitting in his volcano lair, plotting the next feature on Facebook, which will, and when he introduces that feature, we'll we'll post angry messages on Facebook about what a horrible idea this is. That's the kind of the mental model we have about this. But this is sort of exactly the opposite of what's actually happening. What's happening is that we have this enormous appetite for novelty, for information, for speed and convenience. And Facebook and Google and all the rest of them are desperately trying to sate that. They're trying to keep up with what they think their audience wants. Facebook, I don't know, a few years ago when it introduced the news feed, there were howls of complaint because people sort of felt their privacy had been breached because suddenly you could see what everyone else was doing. And the reason they kept it, despite all the protests, was very simple because they could see the volume, the levels of engagement absolutely shoot up. And again, the phone is the perfect thing for this. You'll presumably know about the idea of dopamine and rewards that monkeys, cages, push levers, get sugar drops, brains light up, and this is what happens when we check our email account. That it's not actually even just getting the email, just the knowledge. If I kind of open my phone and sort of see just the knowledge, that little number by a thing saying, "Hey, you've got a notification," that gives you a sort of hit of validation. It gives you kind of neural validation because there's information there, and it gives you social validation because it means someone cares about me. Someone wants to reach out to me, and it's probably someone reaching out to you to sell you dodgy Viagra pills. But for a brief moment, it's like playing the lottery, but you're more likely to win than not. And actually, even the random element of it increases our engagement. So this is a sort of extraordinarily powerful phenomenon. In my book, I talk about our work lives, our social lives, the media, politics, culture. You can see this acceleration, this sort of information, the sort of embrace of information in every. Just thinking about our phones, it's changed how we eat. That suddenly, people are sort of taking pictures of their phones, and eating becomes a kind of a performative act. Going to a restaurant becomes a performative act. In politics, suddenly the ability to stand there with your arm around a random voter and kind of go like that and not look like a complete idiot is an absolutely key skill for a politician. And if you look weird in selfies, suddenly it's going to be much, much harder for you to become Prime Minister, which is, John Key in New Zealand, his election campaign was basically based on selfies. The idea that, it's a really simple form of interaction with voters. They're all going to share it with their friends. You don't have to answer any awkward questions about what your health policy is. You just have to take a photo with them. So, he took thousands upon thousands of selfies and got re-elected. It was a brilliant strategy. And of course, just before Tinder. Just the idea that as recently as 5 years ago, we would do this horrible thing where if we wanted to find someone to date, we'd have to go onto a special website or we'd go to a speed dating evening, and we'd sort of spend ages and ages creating the perfect profile and then trying to find someone who matched it, and we'd engage in some sort of awkward flirty banter with them, and then we'd finally meet them for coffee, and actually we probably wouldn't really like them very much. We were wasting enormous amounts of time. And now you've just got this absolutely instant thing which allows you to kind of, I don't have it on my phone at the moment, otherwise some of you might be in trouble. But you can see who in the neighborhood might be interested in around. It's almost like playing a game. You swipe left, you swipe right. And, for a lot of people, this is, a lot of people think that because of this, we're all going to hell in a handcart. Completely ignoring the fact that if Tinder had been around when they'd been kids, they would have been all over it. So there's this idea, and you can read all sorts of books about this, that it's destroying our brains, it's destroying our power to concentrate. That because we're so addicted to our phones, that when we go home in the evening, we don't sort of put our phone to one side and engage with our family. We carry on checking it. Work seeps into our weekends, seeps into our evenings. We get stressed and strained. All this is kind of true. The worst case scenario for me is a study which was done recently where they asked people to sit for just spend 15 minutes just alone with their thoughts in a room. And half of the people in that study found it an unpleasant experience. They were so used to constant stimulation that they just really didn't know how to cope when it went away. It would be like you guys if I'd piled on the mobile phones here. You were suddenly going, well, but something might have happened, and I need to know that something might have happened, and I need to comment on it on Twitter. So my favourite part about that actually is that they then redid the study, and they give people the opportunity to give themselves a painful electric shock to disrupt the tedium. And if there are any scientists here who can explain this, I would love to know why this is the case. But 2/3 of the men in the study gave themselves the electric shock, and only 1/4 of the women. So there's obviously something very different in our attitudes to stimulation. But yeah, so my book is kind of tries to make an optimistic case about this. And a lot of people kind of don't buy it, and they sort of say, well, how can you be, we're so obviously becoming addicted to our phones. We're so obviously becoming the slaves of technology. We're so obviously, everything is so obviously speeding up, and our poor squidgy bodies can't cope with this amazingly powerful technology. And there's a host of reasons that I'm to be optimistic. And, one is that we've had all these worries before. Whenever any technology has been introduced, you get exactly the same complaints. People complain that the telegraph was being used to spread malicious gossip, that the railroad was being used by criminals to escape justice, that when magazines came in, people said, oh God, this is awful. Instead of the traditional family evening at home, with everyone sitting around the fireside, warming their hands and talking of talking of politics and culture, People are now glued to their own magazines. No one talks to each other anymore. They're just they're the slaves of these printed publications. The language is exactly the same. And the other reason, Rory talks about loss aversion. We've also, that feeds into a kind of pessimism bias, because it makes every kind of sense for us to be alert to anything that threatens what we've got. The rustling in the bushes might be a saber-toothed tiger. That's kind of how we were brought up to, not brought up, but how we kind of evolved. And, my childhood was special. But yeah, so we're loss averse. But if I were to write a book review and to say, this book is engaging, lively, intelligent, and witty, and then I would to write exactly the same book review, but I replaced those words with disappointing, inadequate, not quite as lacking, and humdrum. You would actually consider that second review to be more intelligent. Pessimistic reviews, which are absolutely identical in every way except the adjectives, people consider the writer of them more intelligent. They consider them nastier, but more intelligent. The reason we keep on thinking that the world is going to hell in a handcart is because we're built to, because we're biased that way. Someone else who can't. Another reason to be optimistic about this is that yes, there are sort of costs and risks with acceleration, but we have a better understanding than ever, thanks to the kind of research that people are hopefully going to be talking about today, or that we'll read about how to kind of hack our own systems, how to get the advantages but not the costs. Things like the benefits of mindfulness and meditation. There's now really good evidence for that. There's really good evidence for why it's important to have a good night's sleep and how we can get a good night's sleep. All of there are tools we can use, like rather than donating a $5 to the Leave campaign, you can set your company email accounts so that my absolute favourite one of this is I think it's Daimler, where they not only divert your email to one of your colleagues while you're on holiday, but they delete that email, so that there is absolutely no way when you're on holiday that you can, even if you want to check in with the office, you can't. And the sort of message of all the research is that yes, there's no evidence that if you can make a case that the internet is destroying our brains, you can make a case that it can't. The evidence is really fuzzy, but for most people, most of the time, it's pretty much fine. What you tend to find is that the people who have problems with things like cyberbullying are the people who would be bullied normally. That these are social problems in normal people's lives expressing themselves on the internet, rather than the internet somehow turning us into different kinds of people. But yeah, so the evidence is even when you can see the evidence, even when you can sort of see people's brains shrivel because they're spending too much time on the internet, you can then see people's brains rebuild themselves when they kind of just do like 1 hour classes of meditation for a week. The brain is plastic. We're not doomed to one thing or the other. And this is kind of reflected in the society we see around us. I'm not quite sure how I'm doing for time, but I'll just carry. Okay, 5 minutes. So I'll kind of. So this is reflected in the society we see around us. We're not mindlessly accelerating. If we were just the kind of slaves to our own impulses, there wouldn't be conferences like this, right? We would, bestsellers are getting longer. People, things like Game of Thrones. People are watching that. In journalism, which is where I make my living, we have really good evidence that people want to read really bite-sized, snappy, short, instant pieces, but they also want to read really long, in-depth, beautifully written, kind of involving, gripping stories. The Economist, the New Yorker, the Spectator, all these places are having subscription booms because people want to have the fast and the slow. And what's sort of failing is the people who try to be all things to all men. The kind of what I call the sort of the mushy middle. So the final point, and this kind of brings us back to the mobile phone, is the other argument that people make about this is that we're not really living in an age of acceleration. There was a time period back in the 20th century when we came up with electrification and telegraph and railroads and fridges and cinemas, and what have we got since then? iPhones, great. But actually, life, as Rory mentioned, when you're in a big city, your life speeds up. And the pattern of this next century is going to be humans moving to cities. We are now officially an urban species, and we will become even more so. Billions and billions of people will be in cities, and because they are in cities, they will, by definition, be going faster. And what happens when people in cities go faster is that they bump into each other. They have more encounters. They have more, this creates more crime and more disease, but more importantly, it creates more ideas, more productivity. The wealth of a city, the energy, the innovation, the good things a city produces scales up more than its population because of this effect, because of the way that the acceleration of social interaction. And so for me, the sort of Western-centric view of acceleration is kind of missing the point. That what's actually happening is, over the last 20 years, the number of people with a cell phone in Africa has gone from 1% to 95%. More people now have mobile phones than electricity. When the Americans went into Iraq and sort of said, what do you want? Do you want Suez? Do you want democracy? Do you want justice? They said, no, we want mobile phone towers. Because that is the thing which hooks them into the world economy. It hooks them into information and connectivity. Ultimately, the pace of our lives is accelerating, but it's accelerating because we want to be social. It's accelerating because we want to engage with other people. We want to find out what they're doing. We want the information they're producing. And yes, it can, having all that information, having all those contacts, having all that news come at you, it can be scary and overwhelming. But ultimately, it's kind of what we want. It's what we've been working towards, and it's what's going to it's what's going to continue. So yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. There is a solution to the city thing. The managing director of the Ogilvy Milan office won't hire anybody from Venice because they're too slow. Because if you've grown up in a city where you go everywhere by boat, your conception of time is fundamentally less hurried than if you're used to taking buses or taxis.
But then presumably after a few weeks in the big city...
He claimed they didn't adapt, at least not in the workplace, which is what he cared about. But I think you're being a bit Panglossian for me, actually, which is that the fact that conservatives kick against trends... Conservatives are a bit like your smoke detector, okay? They go off when they make toast. But that's a false positive, but it doesn't mean they're always wrong. And two things I think are worth mentioning, one of which is the pace at which the change is adopted, and also the extent to which it's adopted universally. So that the speed at which Wi-Fi everywhere became as good as Wi-Fi in San Francisco was really sort of 3 years. Okay? So there aren't, in other words, the fact that the change takes place simultaneously means that you're starved of contrasting possibilities. I'm not worried about me so much because I can remember the world before. My children who've grown up in a world where they've never known a world without Wi-Fi on tap, they don't know what was better about working patterns before.
Yeah. So,
for example.
So there's two elements to this. One is I think we definitely do need to preserve space for the slow, even as we move towards the fast. Because, but not least because it helps us be better at going fast, to be able to retreat and have those, have weekends in the country, but also, I was glossing over a whole load of things in this because there's a lot more in the book. But one of the big things is as you say, polarization. So London is getting faster, and London will get faster, and it will pull away because that engine of acceleration, it's already pulled away from most of the rest of the country. It will continue to do so. I was at the Hay Festival last week. You've never seen so many people go around looking vaguely traumatized because it's got no mobile reception.
No, I've been there, yeah.
You know,
Vodafone black spot, absolutely. Yeah.
So places like Silicon Valley, like London, there is going to be this sort of this pulling apart of the people, and I think we're seeing it in politics. And this is actually something I'm really pessimistic about, compared with the sort of technological side of it. That the people who are left behind by acceleration, the people whose jobs have been automated or whose communities haven't benefited from the new industries, they're really angry. They're kind of really unsettled. They're sort of seething, and we're kind of all sitting around sipping lattes and having a great time. And it's really hard to knit those together into the same kind of
So in a sense, what you're seeing is a trend, not so much a trend, it's a vector, which is that as you mentioned in media consumption, strangely slow media or hugely complicated. I mean, if you think Game of Thrones, I have to watch it with my daughter so she can explain what's going on, because I mean, it makes Dickensian novels look pretty straightforward.
But actually, that's an interesting. Game of Thrones is really interesting because it's information rich. It's, the complexity of entertainment.
And you're right about weekly publications, newspapers which sit in the middle get squeezed.
My pet theory about Fleet Street has long been that what will survive is the Saturday and Sunday, or kind of the Sunday Times, the Saturday Telegraph, the Observer, the Saturday, the one thing you get for the sections and the puzzles and the last bundle.
In other words, the long form, relaxed consumption form of the thing.
Yeah.
Questions? We've got two. We do that for scarcity bias reasons. Who's got a question? Must be somebody. Yes, lady there.
I think Tinder still delivers you quite a lot of unsuitable partners. It's just that you get to meet them faster.
There could be choice overload, or the problem that because when people make decisions fast, they make them in a fundamentally different way than when you make a decision under no time pressure.
And one of the factors that determines whether you stay in a relationship is the quality of alternatives available. And the fact that we now have a universe of, it's so much easier to find alternatives, probably means that there's going to be more breakups. So my pet theory about this is that marriage will survive, but only sort of strong, good marriages where it's not worth looking for other people. People won't sort of tough it out in the way that and sort of try to keep a sort of a mediocre relationship alive in the way that they once did, especially if they know they're more, actually there is research on this, especially if they know that they're more attractive than their partner, they're far more likely to go looking for someone else, because if you're an 8 with a 6, you can go and get an 8. That's how the scientists put it. It was.
I mean, it may encourage. New York dating is very weird, even to Londoners, to the degree to which they practice kind of maximising rather than satisficing. There's no role for what you might call serendipity or fate in that. Yeah, and that may make for worse decisions, simply because satisficing is in many cases a better approach than maximising.
And also greater sorting, because one of the things about internet dating is it helps you meet. It means you meet people who are more like you, or especially if you're sort of doing it via existing social networks, it tends to filter it. The people we end up dating are the people who are as like us as possible, and so the odds of people marrying from different social classes is actually decreasing. Which is, yeah.
So next question. I think that's actually a fair point, by the way. Yes, gentleman there. Hi. Brian. Yeah.
So The Economist has written a lot about the suburbanization of the world, that actually the bigger megacities in the world, like Lagos and Jakarta and stuff like that, as soon as you get the tiniest bit of money, you actually get out of it into the suburban sprawl. And do you see a future where actually anybody who is rich enough opts, like Rory has, for a slower quality of life, and actually the sort of acceleration becomes something which is inflicted on the poor?
I don't think so. I mean, I think actually what we've seen in the last sort of 10 years is the revival. 20 years is the revival of city centres. Places like Shoreditch and the developments in Knightsbridge. The super rich. Yeah. But I think I think that's partly part of that sort of about rule of law. That it's much easier to have a gated community and to sort of shut out there's more world to shut out that you want to shut out in places like Lagos. But an interesting thing about city design actually is the self-driving cars, because our entire urban environment is built around the car. Suburbs are creatures of the car, and suddenly what happens when you have like a tenth of the number of cars and you don't have to have garages, and suddenly does high density living become a bit more attractive, or at least not so much high density living, but what are we going to do with all the space that car parks were taking up, for example? Suddenly, if you see maps of cities, especially American cities, suddenly there's going to be all this space available to put new stuff in them, right in the heart of the city, and maybe, it'll be interesting to see what people do with that.
Yeah, you could argue that, people move to cities for the economic advantages they bring, and actually, effectively, they then talk themselves into liking cities, in other words, making a virtue out of necessity, I think, to a degree. There's a hell of a lot of indoctrination in that every single desirable lifestyle, if you watch TV from the 1970s, the epitome of the desirable lifestyle was kind of suburban. If you think of, The Good Life or George and Mildred or whatever, okay? Now, the epitome, if you watch any sort of true life crime thing, the epitome of what a rich, successful person does now is kind of urban. And a hell of a lot of that is actually sort of BBC types imposing a vision. Yeah. Friends, exactly, yeah. So that was a massive, great ad campaign for urbanisation, essentially, unintentionally.
Yeah. But one thing I sort of touch on in the book, and I'd be interested to see whether it happens, is that whether there's a filtering effect as well. That there are people who, my wife would probably ultimately like to move to the country. I probably ultimately would want to stay in the city, because I like to live at a slightly faster pace of life than her. But, being a family, I'll probably bow to what she wants eventually.
You will, just wait.
But I think partly what we may see and what we may be seeing is a kind of filtering effect where, people who like speed live in the city, people who don't like speed live in the cities for a bit, but then move out. And so actually that contributes to the polarization I was talking about.
It might be interesting for a few of the, we're being followed by Isabel, a few of the Darwinists to comment on this, because I've asked the young graduates at Ogilvy why they don't move out. Because actually within easy commuting distance of central London, there is affordable property. And the basic reason is if you live in Bromley, you can't pull, okay? So it's a sort of mating ground, there's a Darwinian reason for this as well, if you think about it. Now, once you've actually spawned, where you want to go is slightly different. So I'll just advise you to take lessons from the salmon here at some level. But undoubtedly different life phases will also change things, and also your preferences fundamentally shift. But thank you very much indeed. That's fantastic. You're around all day.
I'm around all day.
So speak to Robert whenever you can. Thank you very much indeed. Next, fantastic privilege from Oxford and Chile. Isabel Beinheck is a primatologist. Now, primatologists are basically consumer researchers who like jungles. If you think about it, market research is a very, very specialist form of primatology for lazy, unadventurous, greedy people. So what you will see is something I've long believed, is that actually, all forms of meaning, of signalling, require some degree of illogic or wastage. There is no form of advertising which is perfectly efficient, because without some cost implied, it's not a reliable signal and has no meaning. Now, that cost can either be in the form of expenditure, it can be in the form of risk, it can be in the form of financial expenditure, it can be in the form of creativity, the use of something which is scarce and difficult. But without some cost or effort or risk, something that defies absolute conventional logic, there is no messaging. And with a fantastic lesson from some very close relatives, the bonobos, here's Isabel to explain. Thank you very much indeed.